thank you for having me. I actually just got off a plane from Kauai. So just a little bit before I launch into this. As all of you know, there was historic flooding last year on Kauai. And there are a number of people, very fortunately, who have begun to realize that this is very much a climate change event and a climate change impact. So the reality is that the things I'm going to be talking about are not really just theoretical. There are things that are happening. There are things that are happening to rural communities that suffer extensive impacts when you have your entire highway, washed away. And really, last night we had a community meeting in Waniha, and Mayor Kawakami is there. And I'm very, very pleased to see that there really are people who now realize that the new normal here in Hawaii is serious and the impacts are severe. So Kauai is really taking some wonderful affirmative steps to bring in people who look at the impacts of flooding, watersheds, and realizing that climate change is not just about sea level rise, but it's also about these very severe storm events that can have devastating impacts. So, I can move this, okay. So a little bit about environmental justice, energy justice, and climate justice. I know you can all read, but I promise this is the only time I'm going to read to you. Environmental justice, which is really the origin of all of this, started from the deep ecology movement in the 1970s. So out of that, there was a study that was commissioned by the UCC, I should know this, I want to say in the 1980s, that really looked at how certain communities were disadvantaged, disproportionately impacted by things like what we call LULUs, locally unwanted land uses, toxic waste sites, other things. My master's thesis, which was now a million years ago, was actually one of the first studies that looked at the impact of environmental justice here in Hawaii. And what I found was most of our LULUs, locally unwanted land uses, were disproportionately placed on the leeward coast. So while this started on the mainland, it was impacting us here in Hawaii, and it continues to. I am going to point out Ikaika. So his wife, who is Marty Townsend, runs a wonderful, and they initiated an environmental justice tour on Waianae. Does that still happen? It does still happen. So I highly encourage you to come and see these things, to participate in these things, but they have community members, if I'm getting this right, and Ikaika, please correct me if I'm wrong. They take you on a bus with community members to show you all of the environmental impacts along the leeward coast and talk about how they adversely impact that community, not only environmentally, but culturally. So there are some really important organizations and grassroots groups that tackle this here in Hawaii. Energy justice, I'll read it. Environmental justice is the social movement whereby people of all origins, incomes, and classes receive fair treatment and opportunity to meaningfully, engage in decisions related to environmental policies that impact their living conditions and lives. This sort of led to, more recently, in issues related to energy justice. So there's actually a wonderful energy justice program at the law school. Is that still happening? I'm looking at you again, Ikaika. Okay, we'll say yes. Henry will know. Henry, is that still happening? Okay, no one knows. But there's a really good program recently that looks at energy justice issues. And energy justice is an emerging field and movement that applies an environmental justice framework to issues related to energy, including but not limited to how people, particularly marginalized communities, are impacted by energy development, infrastructure, and initiatives. This then moved into the climate justice movement, which I'm going to focus on from here on out. And this is the growing global social movement that frames issues related to global warming and climate change within a justice framework, demanding consideration for how grassroots and marginalized communities are impacted by climate issues, including climate change solutions. So I think some people scratch their heads when they think about climate justice, because they're like, don't you want climate justice, and should we all be working together? But the reality is, as with many things, sometimes the solutions have proven to be problematic. So on the left is sort of a environmental justice protest. It has really evolved to the image on the right, which I took at the Global Climate Action Summit in San Francisco last year. So in addition to what Governor Brown was doing, there were tens of thousands of people from local and indigenous communities who also converged upon this to talk about some of the problems with some of the solutions. So many people, they talk about carbon colonialism, these sort of things that have long been problematic in communities and how they intersect with climate solutions. And really, we're seeing the same thing we saw with environmental justice and energy justice. There's not enough consideration for the impact to these communities, and these communities are not often enough a part of the meaningful dialogues and processes that are taking place. So these are all mine. I had a good time. It was an awesome march. So but the It Takes Roots is part of the Climate Justice Alliance that has worked globally, including at the COPs, to raise awareness about how climate dialogues are not often enough considering their impacts to local and Indigenous communities. You can see on the right, they talk about supporting community solutions, and really part of the crux of this is people have concerns about solutions that allow for just carbon trading and buying of carbon solutions, when really people need to be working on solutions that reduce carbon emissions, period. The impact, I was fortunate enough to be a delegate to the Paris COP and actually worked in the Pacific to help draft the position statement of the Indigenous peoples in the Pacific. And the reality is, the impacts are now. You are losing entire countries, you're losing entire nations. People are being displaced at alarming and unacceptable rates. And without that global commitment to reducing carbon emissions and thinking very hard about making sure that we don't have these impacts, the reality is you're going to continue to see disproportionate impacts to these communities on the ground that get affected first and hardest. So this was actually the poster from the COP24 delegation, but it was the same group that came to the Global Action Summit in San Francisco. And on the right is an elder from the Amazon who came to talk about how both not only these groups that are deforesting at alarming rates, so really you have two separate issues. One, that you have to stop these actions. You have to stop deforestation. You have to stop these processes where you're completely wiping out natural resources to be able to continue industrialization globally the way we know it today. And then second, the fact that where they even have had tried to create protected areas that team up with conservation groups to allow for carbon sequestration or the purchasing of carbon credits, many times those actions in protected areas still displace these communities. So the fact that there's not enough collaboration on the ground, working with communities to make sure these communities are protected, their lives are protected, their livelihoods are protected, their natural resources and their cultural resources are protected, and then even the actions to protect end up having the same impact of completely displacing them from their homelands. And it's not just the Amazon. I want to make that clear. This is really a problem globally. We're seeing it all over the world. We see it in the Amazon particularly. We're seeing it in Africa particularly. And we also have problems here in the Pacific. So what came from this, and again, this was, I want to say at least 2 weeks of meetings and initiatives. There was basically, in addition to what the government put on in California, you had a massive group of events. And what they came up with was making sure that all of these people who represented Indigenous and local communities and grassroots communities went in with the right questions, went in with the capacity to have a meaningful dialogue about the solutions that were being proposed. So this was called the People's Solutions Lens. And the 3 questions they really wanted all of us, and now I hope all of you, to ask anytime any solution gets put on the table or any initiative gets put on the table is, 1, who makes the decisions? So are we thinking about who's in charge? Are we thinking about, is there a mechanism whereby local people or Indigenous people have a seat at the table, a meaningful seat at the table, whereby they can influence the decision-making that is occurring? And if there is opposition or concern, how does that impact the decisions being made? Is this token representation, or is it true opportunity for Indigenous people and local communities who are so significantly impacted by whatever these initiatives are, have the ability to either modify, alter, or even stop the decisions that are being made? Two, who benefits? So this is a significant issue. Many times, and I love the conservation community, I think all of you know that, but I can be critical of them sometimes. So where you do have solutions around these issues, whereby large corporations could potentially grant or buy credits or do these things, where are those benefits going? You have one, again, sort of the ecosystem services benefits that potentially come from reducing emissions, but at the same time, where you have these trading initiatives set up, are those monies really going to the communities that are adversely affected? And you have a significant number of Indigenous peoples groups that feel like even when you do provide some sort of benefit funding to those communities, that can never actually make up for the harm that was caused in the first place. So we are not thinking enough about how these systems that we are setting up that are very well intended and very, very important are actually resulting in redress for local and Indigenous peoples. What else will this impact? So if you are placing, say, a renewable energy initiative, and that is going to result in, like we're seeing with forestry and other issues, if you're going to ultimately further displace people, or if sometimes the solution also creates environmental impact or cultural impact, those are things that need to be taken into consideration. I think at times people have been very, again, sort of scratching their head as to why wind projects or solar projects will see opposition from island communities. But the question is, what else is it impacting? It is not enough to just say we need to put renewable energy out there or we need to put these solutions out there. We need to also think very hard about the additional impacts that those solutions may have. And this is it, right? That's all I got? Okay. So I'm very excited about the key that's being presented to you folks next, because I did get to have some say in it. That was pretty exciting. My hope is that this lens has been inserted into that key. And I do think if the state, this state, and I know there's some wonderful people working on this, like Erin, like Danielle, I do believe we can create a very, very important tool that not only moves climate solutions forward, but they move them forward in a just way, that thinks very hard about issues that have been critical to local people and Indigenous communities. That's all I got. Thank you very much. I think I'm fast, which is unusual for me. Anybody have questions? None? Right on. Okay, thank you. Hi, Henry. I just want to note, I've been an environmental justice expert for Henry Curtis, so I know Henry does really wonderful work, and I know that Henry has been carrying the torch on these issues in particular for a long time. So thank you, Henry.